This is Sharon Garvin of Wayne State College, and this is my screencast for Chapter 17 of the Accounting 2 online course. In Chapter 17, we talk about activity-based costing. The basic difference between activity-based costing and conventional costing is in how we allocate overhead to the product. Under generally accepted accounting principles, we are required to put overhead inside the cost of our products, but it's tough to figure out how much of the light bill or how much of the heat bill or how much of the supervisory salaries or insurance or property taxes or any of those other overhead types of items should go into the cost of the product to give it a fair cost and be able to come up with a fair price based on that cost. So we're going to look today at 4 different ways of putting overhead inside the products, and what you need to be thinking about is what's the fairest way, what seems to be the best way to allocate overhead to these particular products. I tell my students on campus it's kind of like when I had to divide a candy bar between my 2 kids. A lot of different criteria you can use to divide up the candy bar. I have 2 kids, so I could just take the candy bar and divide by 2, write down the half, and give each kid the same amount. Or another criteria I could use age, in which case my older son would get more of the candy bar than his younger sister. Or my daughter liked me to use hair length as a criteria because she had a lot longer hair than her brother did. And if I used that as criteria, she would get more of the candy bar than he would. Again, at the end of the day, 1 candy bar has been divided up. It's the same way under these overhead methods we're talking about. The same amount of overhead gets applied to the products regardless of which of these methods we use. It's the manager's job to say what is the fairest way of doing this. In the same way as a mother, I might say, you know, hair length is probably a pretty stupid way of dividing up a candy bar. So you need to think about what's the fairest, what's going to give us the most accurate indication of what it's really costing us to manufacture our products, and that hopefully will provide us with information with which to make better business decisions. So the example problem here is, let's assume we have a company that on January 1st has predicted we're going to have $100,000 worth of overhead costs next year. That's depreciation, property taxes, insurance, supervisory salaries, janitorial services, etc. And they also expect to have $200,000 worth of direct labor costs during the year. So an accountant could determine what we call the predetermined overhead rate by taking the estimated overhead in the numerator and dividing by 1 cost driver. Under conventional costing, we only have 1 cost driver of direct labor dollars. If you do that, it crunches out to be 0.5. And since we had direct labor dollars in the denominator, when you label it, you'd say the overhead is 0.5 of the direct labor cost, because that's what was in the denominator. Basically, what we're saying here is more overhead should go to products that spend a lot of time in the factory. And one of the ways we can measure how much time a product spends in the factory might be to look at direct labor dollars. If a product has a lot of direct labor dollars assigned to it, it probably spent a lot of time in the factory and should be responsible for more of the light bill, the heat bill, the supervisory salary, and all those other types of overhead costs than a product that doesn't spend much time in the factory. So if you have a little amount of direct labor dollars in your product, you won't have much overhead assigned to it. If you have a lot of direct labor dollars, you will. And as a manager, you need to decide if that's a fair way to allocate the overhead up. This is a job order costing system, and on the job order cost card, whenever materials were used, it was written on the card. Let's assume that's 1,000. Whenever we use direct labor, we wrote that down on the card. Let's assume that's 3,000. Then the accountant gets the card. The accountant understands that the rate is 50% of direct labor costs, so they take the $3,000 of direct labor cost, multiply it by the predetermined overhead rate of 0.5, and say a fair amount of overhead to allocate to this product is $1,500. Therefore, the total cost that I will assign to the product is $5,500. And I'm going to give that information to management people to use to help them make decisions. Again, not necessarily a good method, but it is a method that's acceptable under generally accepted accounting principles, and we hope managers can use that to make better decisions. Now, this is the same company. The only thing that I've changed here is the criteria that the company wants to use. Maybe instead of direct labor dollars, the company wants to measure how much time the product spent in the factory by measuring its direct labor hours. So again, if a product has a lot of direct labor hours, it probably spent a lot of time in the factory and should be responsible for paying more of the light bill and the heat bill and other types of overhead costs than products that don't have a lot of direct labor hours. So to come up with the overhead rate for this, again, I need the estimated overhead on January 1st, 100,000, But now I'm going to divide by the expected amount of direct labor hours for the upcoming year. That's 25,000. 100,000 divided by 25,000 crunches out to be $4. Again, since direct labor hours were in the denominator, when I label this, I'll say $4 per direct labor hour. Product spends 1 hour in the factory, I'm going to give it $4 worth of overhead. Spends 3 hours in the factory, I'm going to give it $12 worth of overhead. The products that spend a lot of time in the factory have to carry or be responsible for more overhead than products that don't. So under this particular job we were dealing with in the first example, materials and labor are the same. But this way, we're going to take our 250 direct labor hours that this particular job took, multiply it by our predetermined overhead application rate of $4, and get $1,000. So under this method, we're saying, okay, now we not only have to keep track of material and labor, we got to keep track of hours, because I need to know the hours to come up with what I consider a fair amount of overhead to allocate to the product. The total cost of the job would be $5,000. The accountant would have this audited by the CPA. The CPA would say, you know, this is fine under generally accepted accounting principles, just like the first one is. It's kind of up to management if they would rather use this method as opposed to the first one. Both are acceptable to me. In both situations, management is trying to allocate overhead based on the amount of time that a product spends in the factory. After World War II, more of our products made in the United States were made by machines than they were made by people. And so some managers feel that using a measure of labor to allocate overhead really isn't fair. If we don't have much labor in the factory happening anymore, maybe some measure of machine usage would be a fair way of allocating overhead to products. This is still conventional costing. We are still putting overhead into our product based on one cost driver, which kind of estimates the amount of time that the factory had this product inside of it. So again, products that have a lot of machine hours probably spend a lot of time in the factory and should be responsible for more of the overhead than products that didn't. So if you're going to do this, you have to know what the estimated overhead is at the beginning of the year, still 100,000. And you have to come up with an estimate of how many machine hours you're going to run during the year, which is based a little bit on how many items you're going to produce. Let's say that's 10,000. So the accountant would crunch out at the beginning of the year an overhead rate of $10. Since machine hours are in the denominator, when we label this, we'd say $10 of overhead for every machine hour that the product has. So if a product takes a half an hour to make by a machine, it would get $5 of overhead. If it takes 4 hours, machine hours, to manufacture, we would assign it $40 worth of overhead. So under our job costing system, material and labor are the same regardless of which of these methods that you use, but we would assume that a fair amount of overhead to allocate would be based on the 300 machine hours this product took times $10 overhead application rate, or $3,000, and a $7,000 cost is what we would assume would be a fair indication of how much the company has invested in this. To use this method, you not only have to keep track of the materials used by the job and the labor used by the job, but now we're going to have to keep track of machine hours before we can calculate what the overhead is. Again, not necessarily a good method, not necessarily a bad method. The question you would have to ask, is it fair? Are our products made basically by people or by machines? Which is a fair way of allocating the cost of overhead to our products? During your lifetime, manufacturing has become much more complex, much more complicated. And so shouldn't the way we cost products be a little bit more complex and complicated as well, so we can come up with a more accurate estimation of what we've got invested in these products, what it's costing us to make these products? And so in Chapter 17, we talk about the development of the ABC, or activity-based costing method. The material costs, the labor costs are going to be the same. The difference is in how we allocate overhead. So we're going to have this $100,000 worth of overhead like we did before, but under activity-based costing we say, okay, what are the activities that we have in our company? And let's take that $100,000 total and divide it into each activity that we have. So on the $100,000 we're going to say, well, $30,000 is for indirect labor, which is closely related to direct labor. $40,000 of the $100,000 is based on the cost running the machines. $20,000 of the $100,000 total is based on machine setups, and $10,000 of the $100,000 total is for design changes by engineers. So instead of one cost driver, because we have 4 activities, we're going to have 4 cost drivers. I need to say what the overhead rates are going to be. And since the first one is based on labor, I could use labor hours as its cost driver. Second one's based on machine usage, so I could use machine hours on that. Third one's based on setups, so I could use number of setups to determine the overhead application rate for that. And the last part is related to design changes, so I could keep track of the number of design changes I have. The products that use a lot of labor hours, a lot of machine hours, a lot of setups, a lot of design changes are basically responsible for a lot of the overhead costs that occur. So those particular products should shoulder more of the responsibility for covering overhead than the products that don't have a lot of labor hours, machine hours, setups, design changes. So a lot of people who advocate ABC say it's a much fairer way of allocating overhead because the products that use a lot of activities will be assigned more overhead than the products that don't. So we're going to come down here, we're going to take our components, the 30,000, the 40,000, the 20, and the 10, and those will be numerators, but again, because we have 4 activities, we're going to have 4 rates. And then we divide by the particular cost driver for each one. So since this one, the top one, was related to direct labor, we could use direct labor hours. The second one was based on machine usage, so we could use machine hours. The third one, number of setups, and the fourth one, number of design changes. And because we have 4 activities, we have 4 rates. Notice how I labeled them. Since I divided by labor hours, this is $1.20 per labor hour. Since I divided by machine hours, $4 per machine hour. Since I divided by setups, it's $200 per setup. And since I divided by the number of design changes, it's $400 per design change. 4 activities, 4 rates. So we would have to, in our system, not only keep track of the materials on a job and the labor on the job, but the accountant will have to know how many labor hours we had, how many machine hours we had, how many setups, how many design changes, because they're going to take those numbers of labor hours, machine hours, setups, and design changes and multiply each one respectively by its overhead application rate. So when you crunch this all out, it crunches out to be $2,900. Under activity-based costing, we think a fair amount of overhead to give to this product is $2,900. When you add these up, we say a fair amount to allocate to the cost of the product is $6,900, and we feel that's more accurate because we're specifically tracing overhead to the products that used a lot of activities. Hopefully, this more accurate piece of information will help us make better business decisions. Understand that activity-based costing is not for every company. If you have a lot of products that are the same or that basically use about the same amount of activities as any other product, activity-based costing is going to cost you a lot of money to implement, and you're not really going to see any resulting benefit from that. But if you have a company that's complicated, that's complex, that has products that use a lot of different activities, and some use an excessive amount of activities, some don't use very many activities, then activities costing is a really good method to more fairly allocate overhead between the products and help you come up with better decisions. Companies that have similar products might go to all the work to do ABC, but the dollar amounts they're going to get for cost of products are going to be pretty much the same as they were before, and they're going to wonder why they went to all the bother. So the only companies that really are benefiting by activity-based costing are those that are complicated, complex, have a lot of activities, and have a lot of variety per product in the number of activities that are used. We have noticed here in the recent Great Recession that we had in the United States, a lot of companies quit using activities costing. They saw the money that it was taking to implement the system and have to keep track of all these extra things, number of setups, number of inspections, number of receipts, number of shipments, number of purchase orders, all those types of things that they had to keep track of in much more detail than they did before. And they said, we need to save money, so we're going to cut out using this program. Besides, it was kind of a failure for us. Understand that the power of ABC is not just implementing it. You've got to go the extra mile and look at the costs and decide how you can reduce your costs by either reducing the number of activities or reducing the cost of performing each activity. So you could reduce the number of setups or reduce the cost of performing the setup, those types of things which were talked about in the PowerPoint presentation. So the companies that failed using ABC generally did so because they didn't go the extra mile. They didn't use the resulting information to try to make the decisions that would help the company save more money than what the program cost them. So unless you're willing to go the full length of the program, ABC is not going to be successful for you. This is the end of my Chapter 17 screencast.